But this evening, we're going to continue our reading in Jason Everett's book here, Male, Female, Other, a Catholic Guide to Understanding Gender. Yeah. I always like to... is it not permissible to pray with a large group of randoms? It's, in my opinion, problematic. For example, I don't know, was this in the 70s or 80s, 90s? I don't remember, but Pope John Paul II hosted a World Day of Prayer. Various world leaders of religions came together all to pray to their respective gods or blah, blah, blah. And it just looked really bad, in my opinion. I don't think it's a good idea because you're basically saying to this guy over here who has a false view of God or no view of God, and how about you sit next to me and do the thing that you do that doesn't reflect the fullness of the faith, and I'm encouraging you to do that thing that you do. I can't encourage them to do that thing that they do because it's inconsistent. So I just can't do that. There is a kind of false ecumenism that people can have, a kind of religious indifferentism, where there is just too high of a tolerance for non-Catholic views. I don't have a very high tolerance because I don't think we have a right to falsehood. We don't have a right to falsehood. We certainly have a right to an intellectual journey, for sure. And we may be at different places in said journeys. But that's altogether different, right? That has to do with not coercing and intimidating and torturing people to accept certain philosophical propositions. I'm not proposing that, right? On the flip side is, well, why can't you do that? Because isn't the condition of the soul more important than the body? So who cares if you torture a person physically in order to try to bring about some sort of spiritual conversion or what have you, or some arguments along those lines? It's because we have inherent human dignity that, we're rational beings and we have a right to figure it out, right? We have a right for our own intellect to be drawn by the good, the true, and the beautiful. Even though we could get it wrong, we don't have a right to the wrongness of the ideas. We have a right to reason. So with that said, I would say no, I can't participate in a large group. At one time I did. I was asked at my, maybe it was a 10 or 15 year high school reunion, shared a prayer, but looking back on it, I had the same, number one, I had the same concern, but I went ahead and did it anyways. Now I have the same concern, and I don't want to participate in that. I don't. I personally don't. So, like I said under these conditions where you have non-theists in the room, or you have conflicting theistic concepts, and we may be praying to completely different gods. That being the case, I would not be able to lead the whole room in prayer. Lead them to pray to what? Right? I can't lead them to pray to their respective gods or concepts or anything like that. And I can't expect them to be led by me to pray to my God. So I said no. May have seemed weird, but I said, yeah. If I find somebody else to do it, hey, Commander. I'm not trying to upset people. It's just, and I don't have to go into great detail to it. So thankfully, she took my response and and she didn't push, and that was great. But yeah, I stood up for what my conviction was at the time. I didn't second guess my thinking, and I just went with that. In terms of what do I think is the most appropriate. I mean, I do think that prayer is appropriate, but I don't think anybody was ever in danger. Yeah, pretty much, Commander. Yeah, so we're going to continue our reading here. Um, so it looks like the argument here is this is the argument that someone might propose. Many people assume that those who experience gender dysphoria possess intersex conditions or are gender nonconforming didn't exist before the internet. While there has been a surge of interest in these topics in recent decades, history provides ample evidence that such individuals have been part of humanity for thousands of years. It's only because of greater visibility and tolerance that they're now finally free to be themselves. Well, before I get into reading, it's um, yeah, a psychological condition that is in the DSM 5. Um, there is a diagnosis called gender dysphoria. Some people have said psychological condition. Uh, and that condition existed before the diagnoses. And the diagnoses is what it is because it lies outside the range of normacy for psychological health of the mind correlating to reality. Um, of course, intersex conditions, chromosomal aberrations, uh, what is it? Androgen insensitivity disorders, all kinds of different things that can happen in nature. Those things certainly do exist. But this is when things go wrong, right? So it's like people trying to say, "Oh, we celebrate autism." Like autistic people are people too. Well, people are people. People can have medical, psychological, emotional problems. Um, People can deal with anomalies and aberrations and disease and disorders and conditions and all the rest. These things exist within nature, but it's not what is considered within the range of what we would consider healthy, right? Someone might have a leg amputated. Somebody might be born with one leg. They're still human, but humans still have two legs. Something went wrong. We're not going to celebrate. We're going to celebrate people in dignity, even when something goes wrong. But what I think isn't healthy is to try to normalize the thing that is wrong. See, there's a difference. Yes, I do think that ADHD, autism, and things can be overly diagnosed. Yeah. Um, but it can be challenging because autism is a spectrum disorder. So there isn't going to be, say, a black and white set criteria. I mean, there is the criteria, the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5 for it, autism spectrum disorder, which has subsumed the Asperger's syndrome of the DSM-4. It may be different because some people who are diagnosed as autistic can be very high functioning, but they can have they can be like emotionally impaired and other things, or they could be nonverbal. Some could be verbal, or they have they have to develop a different form of communication and so on and so forth. Humans can communicate in many different ways. There are people who are blind who have to read Braille. There are people who can't speak who learn sign language. Each of those means of communication exist because something has gone wrong. Either hearing that is normally there is not functioning. The person is blind. Normally humans can see and speak and so on and so forth. Something goes wrong, and so we have to develop additional ways of being able to communicate with one another. Now, if somebody has to live a lifestyle of having to cope, all right, I would use the word cope. So a person learning Braille is attempting to cope with the fact that they are unable to see and be able to read books and text and so on and so forth. They're trying to cope with their condition, having to learn things that most people don't have to learn and won't learn because they don't have to, because they have fully functioning eyes. Now, once again, this person doesn't have any less dignity than they had before. No, would Braille have even been invented if blindness never existed? Maybe, I don't know. People get creative with all kinds of stuff. But the point is that we can't normalize something that is actually abnormal, right? So here's the thing. If there's a range of normacy, the diagnostic tool helps to examine those things that are borderline and go beyond that line into abnormality, which makes it even difficult for people to cope. When it comes to perception of reality, psychological conditions such as bodily integrity, dysmorphia, and other forms like anorexia, bulimia, these sorts of things, there is a misalignment between what's in the mind and what's outside of the mind. And that is problematic. When these perceptions are highly charged with emotion and other mental, other accompanying mental illness conditions, it can exacerbate this disconnect. And sometimes this kind of neurosis or psychosis ends up being a replacement of some sort for reality, because reality can be difficult to cope with. Yeah, I get it, right? I get it. I think I said this once. It's like a factory error. Saying someone is born with something abnormal doesn't mean they're any less deserving of human dignity. Yeah, exactly. All it is, it's statistics, and this is the range of normacy. If something falls outside of that, that means you have additional struggles. Something's not working right. Your liver is, or your kidney is sideways. Like, what's that mean? Well, the kidney's not normally like positioned like that, or there's some heart condition that somebody might have to take medication for. They may eventually need surgery. There's all kinds of things that can be malformed in the body that leads to a lower life expectancy. Now, this is why in life insurance, you're probably going to have to pay a much higher premium because you have a condition that is going to lower your life expectancy. It doesn't have anything to do with human dignity. It has to do with the fact that something's just not functioning right. If if the kidneys and the liver and things aren't filtering things out well, then you have dialysis. You have other kinds of issues, medical interventions that we may have to involve ourselves in because the body is not functioning normally. Okay, so I like to make that distinction. Sometimes people hear the word normal and think the opposite of normal is weird. No, I'm just saying there's a range of normacy, right? So if you go to the doctor and you have a range of healthy weight, right? A healthy BMI. They take your blood pressure. It could be low, it could be high, but you don't know what low and high is unless there's an actual range of what it's expected to be based on years, decades of statistics, and so on and so forth. There may be certain occurrences within nature, but that says nothing about whether or not it's a deviation from a norm. And when it comes to things functioning well in nature, just like they do with like machinery, because we're biological, an aspect of ourselves is biological machinery. There's a range of deviation that can occur, but still be within tolerance for specification. For instance, before there's any suspect of possible problems arising from it. When a doctor says that your cholesterol is a little high, he knows what a little high is based on a norm. And so I think it's imperative for the individual to take the doctor's advice and maybe adjust his diet a little bit. Well, once again, it has nothing to do with the dignity of the person. It has to do with the health of the person, the emotional health, psychological health, right? The mental health. Very, very important. So, varied expressions and understandings of sexual identity are indeed as old as humanity itself. Humans can have all kinds of thoughts about different subjects, right? More than 2,000 years ago, the Roman emperor, great names. I hate names in places. I can never pronounce them. Elagabalus claimed he was a woman and preferred to be called a lady rather than a lord. Blurring gender distinctions was also a common practice woven into many ancient religious rites. In ancient Mesopotamia, gender bending priests offered worship to various goddesses, including Ishtar. One of the poems written about her, dating back to the 23rd century BC, states, "To destroy, to create, to tear out, to establish are yours. To turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man are yours." So if you want to blame that idea on anybody, you can blame the goddess Ishtar, not the God of the Old Testament. Similarly, Roman priests, known as the Galli, castrated themselves and dressed as women and served the goddess Cybele, an intersex deity, said to have been born with male and female features. In his classic work, written in the 5th century, The City of God, St. Augustine said of them, "As recently as yesterday, they plied the streets of Carthage with their oiled hair, their powdered faces, their languid limbs, and their feminine gait." End quote. St. Augustine also mentioned individuals who had intersex conditions. He wrote, "As for the androgyni, or the hermaphrodites, as they are called, though they are rare, yet from time to time there appears persons of sex so doubtful that it remains uncertain from which sex they take their name. Comes from Augustine in the 4th century. Therefore, cultures throughout history offer clear evidence that expressions of sexual identity have been understood and lived out in a variety of ways. However, what accounts for the unprecedented rise in the number of young people who identify as trans today can be attributed to the goddess Ishtar. I joke. He's raising this question, right? The answer is complex and cannot be reduced to increased visibility and tolerance, so this does play a role. Obviously, the more you focus on something, the more people are talking about it, the more influence it can have on people from an ideological perspective. Imagine the flood of a river, swollen beyond its banks. If you were to trace the origin of every drop, you might find that a certain portion originated in heavy rainfall. Perhaps a dam had broken, or recent weather changes rapidly melted snow caps. Springs may have opened from underground sources. As a result of each of these factors, smaller streams and rivers become engorged, and the flow of their tributaries poured into the larger waterway that is now uprooting villages in the current downstream. Do you think the ancient gods were demons or just made up? I think it's a combination of things. I mean, obviously, demons would want to mislead and draw people who had a very strong religious disposition to worship something, right? To adore something, to lead them to idols. It in a very well might be some other God conception and whatnot. I always find it weird. Like, I remember this video vividly of this girl. She's recording herself while she's making dinner, right? And she's making spaghetti. She's breaking the spaghetti thing. She's doing all this stuff, and she's like, "Why should I worship your god? Why not Thor? Why not Zeus?" And basically all she was doing was just parroting stuff from The God Delusion from Richard Dawkins, who was a really bad philosopher, I should say. And it is it's weird because Thor isn't very impressive because he's contingent. Zeus isn't very impressive because he's contingent. These are very human-like beings who have beginnings and have flaws and all this other stuff. They don't fit the philosophical definition of a necessary being, and therefore not worthy of our consideration. I'm not sure about the authenticity of the Apocrypha, but I heard the Nephilim were worshipped by civilizations of half human, half god. I don't know if that was the Apocrypha. I think it depends on what you define as Apocrypha. There was a work called the Book of Enoch, which does talk about the Nephilim. And while I don't remember all the particulars, I've heard Tim Staples talk about the Book of Enoch, and he elaborates on it. I thought about just sitting down and reading it through at one point, and I remember making some comments about it after listening to I think maybe it was like a 30 or 40 minute conversation that Tim Staples was having with someone about the Book of Enoch. Yeah, I mean, it's quoted by the New Testament. You see the Nephilim mentioned in Genesis in relation to the flood. And I mean that gets really elaborated on in the Hollywood production Noah, which takes a lot from the book of Enoch and then does its own things from it as well. Um, but the point of going back to the original question, um, basically a demon's job would be to get someone to not worship the absolute necessary being and to have one worship something substandard to that conception. So instead of worshiping Anselm's conception of that beyond which no thought can conceive, that the ontological argument, for instance, along those lines, that is worthy of our intellectual assent as opposed to substandard conceptions that are very contingent. They were created, they didn't create things, you know, they had an origin, they were born. It's just, that's not, that's more like Star Trek stuff, you know. Like the Q, for example, aren't even worthy of worship. Let's be honest. If you think Q or even the entire continuum itself is worthy of worship, it's still substandard to the philosophical conception of a necessary being, because they do not necessarily exist. Do I believe in a literal flood? At most, there was probably a local flood. I don't know about a worldwide flood. And even if there was, and some people make attempts to try to prove that, um, I'm indifferent to that particular thing because Genesis 1 through 11 is more of a primeval history. It has a certain historical character to it that is slightly different than what we would find in when we begin to get into when we get into the story of Abraham, for instance. You know, I don't think one should look to the first 11 chapters, the primeval history, the Tower of Babel, the flood, being overly literalistic about the formation of man, stuff like that. I don't think that it's the kind of genre that we would take in a literalistic way. I believe it conveys to us certain theological truths, for instance, um, that are very important. And we see some of that language reflected, like when it comes to, say, the Ten Commandments, where it explicitly states that God had created the earth in 6 days, which is alluding back to the the narrative, right? The structured, very literarily structured account, two accounts, really, of creation, of man. I personally don't get literalistic about it. I'm not a fundamentalist. I don't believe in the dictation theory of Scripture. I do believe in its inerrancy and its inspiration, but I don't believe that it was dictated, and so I don't take it very literalistically. I treat it as fully human as well as being fully inspired by God. So I appreciate the various literary genres and things, and I wouldn't place. Now, obviously, we see in the New Testament allusions back to the flood. For instance, it says that Jesus went to the souls When he went to Sheol, he went to the abode of Abraham's bosom, to the righteous abode, and he preached. Even the souls who were lost and were not in paradise received the message, received in hearing the gospel, and so on and so forth, even if they were not led out of Sheol by Christ at the time of his ascension and opening up heaven and drawing and emptying paradise. Obviously, there would have to be souls that were at a time of a flood. So it may have been a local flood, but it also says that water was X amount feet over the highest mountain in the region, and so it obviously, and we see flood legends and surrounding areas as well. So flooding certainly is a common phenomenon throughout the world. There may have been a massive flood event in primeval history and in the early time of man that was notable enough. For instance, obviously there's a depiction of the Noahic covenant with the rainbow in the sky and and all of that stuff. So do I think Noah was a historical figure? Do I think that Jonah was a historical figure? Was he really in the belly of a whale 3 days? Be like, yeah, sure. But that also doesn't mean that they don't serve as some sort of archetype of an individual. I'm willing to grant some flexibility in the genre. So I don't have to like for instance, Jesus says that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch, but he could not have written all of the Pentateuch because the last paragraph of Deuteronomy is talking about after Moses had died and what they did with his body and everything. So, I mean, obviously he didn't pen everything that we consider to be the Pentateuch. But in general, Moses was probably the main author of the text. I don't get into the whole documentary hypotheses and all of that stuff. I think it's not worth. I don't really think it's worth getting into, to be honest. Some people may want to spend all of their scholarship, trying to figure out whether or not there's 4 different, main authors that some redactor, pulled together into a final form at some point, and this and that. And I don't find any interest in that, because even if there were redactions and this and that, it's the final form that we have. It has been tradition to us, and that is accepted by the community. And it's to be read as a whole. So it really doesn't have any significance of trying to hypothesize several authors being pieced together. But let's not get too far off on case here. So I just not even sure what counts as apocrypha or not. Well, I think apocrypha just means like hidden or something like that, doesn't it? And it's usually a term of derision that's used by Protestants to attack the deuterocanonical texts, like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Tobit, Judith, and the Wisdom of Solomon and whatnot, Ecclesiastes, Sirach. I said Tobit, I think. That's how unfair with I am, but unfamiliar. But Enoch was the specific example cited. Okay, very good. I just struggle with know what parts to take literally or not. Starts to seem too subjective quickly. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, I'm not going to fault people for having some flexibility in their reading. Even in the 4th century, Augustine, for instance, highly popularized a more of an allegorical reading of certain things, and like the creation narrative, for instance. The church has never officially defined any particular reading of the text, except that there is a God. He created heaven and earth. He created everything, and he basically is responsible for breathing into us life, right? So we believe that God creates an individual soul at the moment of conception, that we are created in his image and likeness in this way, that makes us unique, that we have an intellect, that we have a will, there's self-determination, there's an immaterial aspect of ourselves. God is immaterial. The soul will exist for all eternity, you know. That's why hell is an actual possibility, because the eternality of the soul, because it cannot die, because it's not a composite. It can't break down into smaller pieces. The soul, it's immaterial, and so it is by nature eternal. All right, so a theory I've been thinking about lately is assuming aliens are real. What if some false gods are aliens? Oh, you mean like in the movie Stargate, how they worshipped Ra, but he was really just an alien. A group of aliens take advantage of a civilization, and the demons benefit by steering humanity away from God. I mean, thankfully, they were able to reveal to the people that this. They never got to the alien stage, but that the people that they were afraid of and honored were just men like they were. So they could see that they were actually being enslaved by, beings like themselves. It's a very good movie. I'm pretty sure everybody's seen Stargate from now. Right. So a similar cascade of historical facts has contributed to the current deluge of interest in the topic of gender theory. To understand the various forces at work, a thorough examination of the intellectual foundation and architects of gender theory is essential. By examining the evolution of gender theory over the past century, it becomes clear that the exponential rise in individuals identifying as trans cannot be attributed to social acceptance alone. The reason why this is important, why people are quite interested in the history of thought, right? Of interpretation of nature and things like that. It really does come down to what was being taught in the universities in the 1930s and stuff like that. Things that were taught in higher education that begins to become more streamlined and trickles down. People are having these particular thoughts, as opposed to some other thoughts that may be in opposition, because they are specifically being taught to interpret something a certain way. If you were taught your whole life that what you experience as anger is a positive thing, and that you should always act on all of your impulses, and you were always praised for doing it, you may develop that this is actually a good thing, and it would actually be bad for you to avoid it. We've talked about it before, that human nature throughout all of time that we've been on this planet, we are capable of a broad range of ideations. We can have all kinds of ideas, right? All over the place. Certain ideas arguably should not be entertained. I don't think that there's hardcore leftists who would disagree with that idea. What we would disagree on is not the form, but the substance. What exactly? What are we talking about? Likewise, we feel, right? We have all of these inclinations. We have all these things that we have felt, and these emotions that we have, and there are certain things, for instance, that we just shouldn't explore. You know, if somebody finds themselves highly attracted to children, for instance, the pedophiles, it's not just a societal taboo that may pass within time and gain acceptance in society and therefore be deemed morally permissible. There is, it's woven in nature itself that children who have not reached the age of puberty should not at all be sexualized. All right. I think nature itself kind of helps us to discern what is and is not permissible. I think even if a culture had decided, like Alicia or whatever her name was, the girl that was probably 8 years old or maybe even younger, who was given in marriage to Mohammed. Aisha. That was her name, Aisha. Once again, it doesn't matter if something becomes culturally acceptable for any reason. There's a good argument to be made in nature itself that, a girl who is not capable of conceiving children shouldn't be engaging in the act of that leads to the conception of children, for instance. I think there's something built into nature itself. There's other factors to be considered as well, not just that one. But that certainly happens to be interesting. Don't worry, I'm not like that alien guy in the History Channel. I don't think everything is aliens. That's funny. On one of his episodes, he said Noah's Ark was built by aliens. Oh yeah, well, the pyramids were built by aliens. Stonehenge was built by aliens. It's all aliens, man. We only exist because aliens seeded this planet. Come on, aliens, man. We've all seen Star Trek. What if trans people are aliens and these multiple genders come from another galaxy? That's in quotation marks. Where did you get this quotation from, I should say? But one particular idea here. So Karl Marx and Frederick Engels were socialist philosophers and political theorists who believed that class struggle defines history. All right, so if you hear people on the right talk about social Marxism or using this kind of language, their attempt is to understand the intellectual tradition that led to certain types of ideologies or behaviors that we might see and try to interpret in society today. When you have some of the head people in BLM, for instance, saying we're trained Marxists, uh, they're probably quite familiar with some of the basic tenets of Marxist socialist theory and all the rest, and what particular behaviors therefore would be consistent with it in an attempt to shape society and create a new hegemony and so on and so forth. These ideas actually do come from somewhere. So when people say, well, that the group is Marxist, it, that's one of the intellectual roots of it, is an undeniable thing. And so understanding how people can attempt to socially engineer outcomes in society based on some of these tenets need to be recognized for what they are. And then they also need to be critiqued at their source. So instead of teachers in high school who want their students to write one paragraph on different economic systems, and they want them to do, I read through some that were written by people about socialism, and it was always written in a very positive form. Like socialism was always like a good thing. But it's how it's defined, right? But it's also real socialism has never been tried, right? But wherever we've seen these economic systems, they always lead to communism. In fact, you need a particular political system to control economics in such a way so that these are the kinds of outcomes that would be achieved. Yeah. But yeah, simply understanding these things and then critiquing things at their source, I think, is very important. Yeah. So together they authored the Communist Manifesto, which is a brief political document that called for communist revolution and a forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions, and predicted that socialism would replace capitalism. Right. Economic philosophies might seem unrelated to the modern concept of gender theory, but the bridge to understanding the connection is the Marxist framework itself. Marx believed that the upper class, the bourgeoisie, possessed the unfair advantage of wealth that the working class, the proletariat, did not. Therefore, the problem of class struggle could only be resolved by erasing class distinctions. Through this, a dictatorship of the proletariat could be created. Gender theory is built upon the same framework. Those who are cisgender possess an unfair culture of acceptance that transgender individuals lack. By eliminating the concept of a sexual binary, a dictatorship of gender theory can arise. Then the freedom to manifest sexual identity apart from the oppressive force of the binary can be realized. One definition of binary is a division into two groups or classes that are considered diametrically opposite. Simply stating that we are a sexually dimorphic species should not be a controversial one. And just because somebody is not just XX or XY, but various combinations of additional X's and Y's and omission, basically deletion. There's 3 different types of chromosomal aberrations that can occur. One would be duplication. deletion, and I think something even or additions or things being transposed. There's different things that can occur that lead to aberrations. These aren't distinct genders. These are, for instance, if somebody had a deletion or addition or something going on at a different part of their DNA, they would end up with Down syndrome, for instance. It's when things go wrong. If somebody ends up with like Klinefelter's or Turner syndrome or something like that. These are syndromes. These are things that aren't just an additional gender or like a third gender or something like that. These aren't genders. Because I see no utility to the word gender as opposed beyond using the term within the context of grammar or using it colloquially as a synonym for or interchangeable with the word sex to indicate the binary of the sexually dimorphic species. So you had to take a sociology or a socialism professor in college who was a diehard communist. He adored Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. One day during coronavirus lockdowns, he was preaching communism again, and I left it pick up a package from my doorstep that I bought with capital. Sure, okay. Viewing masculinity and femininity as diametrical opposites rather than complementary creates creations as a distinctively Marxist conception. So instead of seeing masculinity and femininity as complementary, they would be viewed as diametrical opposites than who are fighting for control or power and so on and so forth. So the patriarchy, right? The patriarchy. We have to tear down the patriarchy. It's like saying, well, the Constitution is a patriarchal document because it was only written by men. How can that represent we the people? We need to tear it down. We need to burn that Constitution. We got to get rid of it. We have to get we have to get a committee. Make sure it's fully diverse, right? We need citizens, non-citizens, people from every gene pool of, as long as you don't have Christians on there, right? We can't have Christians. So those are the bigots. We're going to craft a new constitution, that's about equity and inclusion, and you know what, people, I see what you're doing there. I see what you're doing there. Good ideas are still good ideas, even if it was a room full of men who put it together. So much of Marxist thought was influenced by the dialectic idea of the German philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. The dialectic. Who proposed that history progresses toward utopia via resolution. However, if the most basic class of society is marriage and family, and history is essentially the story of class struggle, then to create justice, a revolution is needed to overthrow the family structure itself. Then utopia will follow. Thus, the manifesto declares abolition of the family. End quote. Yes, the manifesto says that. You have to destroy the family. If you remember, that was on BLM's website, right? The not this exact language of abolish, but what was the language? I think they took it down at some point too, right? The nuclear family, right? Yeah, yeah, wants to destroy society. Well, how about we eliminate fatherless homes, create responsibility, breadwinners, uh, men of consequence who make a difference, who do what is right, do what is needed to be done to provide for, care for, and offer spiritual leadership for their family. Communities that have a higher rate of fathers in the home that are responsible, their children end up being more well adjusted, lower crime rates, higher health, and they end up having higher educational levels and higher levels of success and earning income to provide for their families. You know? But, the ongoing revolution of, hey, let's destroy that. Then we'll be free, being naked, shooting heroin on the beach somewhere, you know, girls under every arm. There's only two, but that's true freedom, true licentiousness. Just do whatever you want, titillate all your passions. That's what freedom is. We have to destroy everything, the ruthless criticism of everything. Just tear it all down. The continuous ongoing revolution. Just keep tearing it down. Yeah, it's sad. If the Constitutional were patriarchal, it would say we the man, or we the men. Women also did their own part during the Revolutionary War too. Yeah, absolutely. One of the movies I actually like is a League of Their Own. When the men were out for war, they created this women's league of baseball players and have them wear these like really skimpy dresses. It's a great movie. I like it a lot. I mean, I don't like. You know, saw some of the actresses in it, but it's a fun film. I like Jimmy Dugan. Just he's funny. Yeah, Jimmy Dugan. Yeah. Yeah, I like that part where he got hired, right, and he's not paying attention to the girls playing baseball. He's not interested. He's not into it. And so he's just sitting there sleeping, doing whatever on the bench, and afterward the guy who hired him, right, he came up to him. I especially liked that move you did during the seventh inning when you scratched your balls for an hour. He's like, Jimmy Dugan's like, hey, anything worth doing is worth doing right. That's great. That's good stuff, man. It's good stuff. It's funny. A League of Their Own is a good one. True freedom is being a tax slave to the government and waking up lonely with STDs, realizing you don't have a family of your own. Yeah, that's what they're trying to sell us. I'm not interested in that. And interestingly enough, the church continues to speak of the ecclesia domestica, right? The ecclesia domestica, the domestic church, the family, the husband, the wife, the children, and yeah, it's always going to be that. It's always going to be that. The church isn't going to change its teachings on any of that. Church can't change its teaching. It's not capable of doing it. the church can't. It can't do that. Let's see, Marxism. But that's interesting. I didn't know that Marx was influenced by Hegel and his dialectic. Is that the there's a synthesis and there's the antithesis and then there's the synthesis, right? And your new synthesis becomes a new thesis or a new antithesis, and then you create a new synthesis, and it's just the ongoing process of critiquing the thesis with an antithesis and coming up with a new synthesis. If I remember correctly, that was Hegel. Yeah, nothing says oppression like goodness and freedom. Like responsibility is like a dirty word, you know. If my son has to change the litter box one more time, you know, real freedom is, you know, just complete freedom from. You know, I mean, I kind of get it a little bit. Now, there is an entire theology of work, which we can spend a whole stream on at some point in the future. But um, yeah, I mean, am I entirely happy with where I work? No. Do I make enough money? No. But am I bringing home money for my family? Yeah. So I may not like the process. It's like one encouraging thought for students who are going through certain classes that they're not really interested in. It's part of the curriculum. It's something they have to get through to get to their diplomas that will gain access to certain jobs that require diplomas. They just continue to tell themselves, you know, it's the end result that I want. You know, and this process is what's supposed to shape me to be a better person, to be more fully equipped. You know, in his work, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Engels spoke of what he considered the antagonism between men and women in monogamous marriage. He noted, quote, "The first class oppression coincides with that of the female sex by the male," end quote. Through marriage, quote, "the woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children," end quote. My wife doesn't feel that way. In Engels' worldview, the family is the foundation of the domestic slavery of the wife, end quote. Now, that's not the problem with the family. That's the problem with the husband being a dick. Right? Those are different things. Just because some guy is a bad husband and he's not treating his wife with dignity, that doesn't mean that marriage is bad now or that the family's bad. No, it just means that he's not being a good husband. He's not being a good father. All right? Well, how about, once again, goodness, right? How about he just be good? He doesn't have a right to any of those things, to treat people poorly. Nobody has a right to heresy or to sin. We don't have a right to that. We have a right to what is right, to goodness, to truth, to beauty. Those are rights. Engel proposed that the solution to this injustice is to insert women into the workforce. And, quote, "this in turn demands the abolition of the monogamous family as an economic unit of society," end quote. See, he purposely wants to destroy the family. While it may seem that Engel is gallantly hoping to protect women from lust, he explains that these societal changes will hopefully, quote, "bring about the gradual growth of unconstrained sexual intercourse." The gradual growth of unconstrained. Nonetheless, many radical feminists saw in this system an opportunity for liberation. If the relationship between men and women is dialectical, then equality can only be established by erasing sexual difference. As one trans advocate later argued, quote, women couldn't be oppressed if there was no such thing as a woman. Doing away with gender is the key to doing away with patriarchy. Like what? Let me read that again. Women couldn't be oppressed if there was no such thing as a woman. See, that's their solution. They want to change the. I know it's weird, isn't it? It's like, yeah, it's no, no. How about we say that nobody would be oppressed if people wouldn't be jerks? It has nothing to do with. See, all they're doing is they're trying to find some solution instead of proposing holiness that leads to happiness. They want to propose anything other than that because God is holy, and you certainly can't have, God communicating to us something about goodness and beauty and truth, because if we're gonna craft whatever we want by our intellect, without ascending and using a rational will and all the sort. You can't have God in there. You can't have goodness. You can't have holiness. That can't be the answer. Living a good life, developing a life of virtue. No, that can't possibly be the answer. What the answer is that we shouldn't even have a designation of women, because then no woman would ever be oppressed because there wouldn't be anybody by that designation. Yeah, these people are idiots. Doing away with gender is the key to doing away with patriarchy. Because it's funny because if there aren't men either, men can't be men who are oppressing women, but there are men and there are women. Hey, whoever's capable for the role, I don't care. But, back in the day when men were out hunting and maybe even being warriors and defending their tribes and all the rest, it's very difficult to also do all of that while raising children, making a home, and preparing food. I mean, not everybody can do everything. But a woman's biology, for instance, tethers her to offspring. She carries the child for 9 months. She gives birth to the child, and then she feeds the child from her body. There is a natural role that grows out of just the state of nature itself. So were women going out and hunting? I mean, I'm sure they probably could if they didn't have children yet. But once you have children, I mean, who's going to watch the kids while, or even feed the kids if she still has a child in arms? So it's just very convenient. There's just nature, and then there's the role that is suitable to the natural condition. It's not about oppression. So a woman who feels like, well, I can't go back to work because I'm breastfeeding or I'm taking care of my child. Well, that's what your body is supposed to do. It's society that wants to get the woman away from her child So everybody else feeds the child with formula, sends the kid to, daycare all day, and is away from the mother, away from that bonding, that skin to skin contact, the health benefits of breastfeeding, and all of that stuff. It's just trying to craft a new way of having a role of trying to free the woman from a biological responsibility. It's just what it is. Okay, that sounds good, Captain. Okay, I gotta get going. We've been live for an hour and 20 minutes. We talked about Karl Marx. We talked about the Old Testament. We talked about the family and BLM and all the rest. So that's all I have for tonight. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. God bless. And I gotta wake up early, so I'm not gonna be down here till like 11:30 or whatnot. But man, I'll probably end up playing some Hearthstone tomorrow. What's tomorrow? Wednesday? Yeah, I think there's a new Tavern Brawl out on Wednesday. So with that said, have a great night. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll continue to have conversations of consequence.